find somewhere comfortable. You don't need to sit up straight or keep your eyes open or hold any of this in your mind. You don't need to remember a single word of what follows. Just let the words come to you the way warmth comes from a radiator. Not something you reach for, just something that arrives. Tonight we are going back a long way. Back before the internet, before the telephone, before the steam engine and the newspaper and the paperback novel. Back to a world where a single book could cost as much as a farm, where most people lived and died without ever holding one, and where the slow, patient hand of a monk in a candlelit room was the only means by which human knowledge moved from one generation to the next. And then something changed. Quietly, in a workshop in a small German city, a goldsmith began experimenting with metal alloys and wooden screws, and the world, though it did not know it yet, began its long turn toward everything we now call modern. If today was hard, if you are carrying something into this night that feels heavier than it should, you don't need to put it down on purpose. Just let the words settle around you. The story will do the rest. We are in no hurry here. It has been waiting centuries to be told, and it can wait a little longer while you get comfortable. We begin at the beginning, long before the press, long before the change. Picture a monastery in the north of France, sometime in the year 1200. Outside, it is October. The fields have been harvested, and the light comes low and grey across the valley. Inside, in a room the monks call the Scriptorium, the writing room, a single candle burns. He has been sitting there since before dawn. He will sit there until the light fails. He is copying a book. The work is slow in a way that is almost impossible to imagine now. Each letter must be formed individually, with a quill cut from a goose feather, dipped into a small pot of ink made from oak galls, those strange round growths that appear on oak trees where a wasp has laid its eggs. Oak galls are rich in a compound called tannic acid, and when that acid is combined with iron salts and dissolved in water or wine, it produces a dark, permanent ink that bites slightly into the surface of the page, rather than merely resting on top of it. The chemistry is simple, but the result is durable. Some manuscripts written in oak gall ink have survived 800 years and remain legible today. But the page itself, that is another matter entirely. The monk is not writing on paper. He is writing on vellum, which is made from the skin of a calf. The skin must first be soaked in a lime solution for several days to loosen the hair, then scraped with a curved blade while still stretched on a wooden frame, then dried under tension so that it becomes thin and smooth and pale as cream. A single sheet of vellum requires one calf. A complete Bible, which might run to 400 or 500 sheets, requires the skins of somewhere between 100 and 200 calves, not just the labor, but the livestock. A Bible was, in a very literal sense, a small herd of animals compressed into pages. The cost was proportional. A finished Bible, bound and illuminated, might be valued at the equivalent of a farm, not a small holding, but a working farm with land and outbuildings. A single volume of Aristotle's philosophy, the kind of text a university might wish to own, could cost the equivalent of a craftsman's wages for 2 years. Books were not objects that ordinary people encountered. They were possessions of institutions, monasteries, cathedrals, the occasional great lord, and of the church above all. A bishop might own a dozen, a prosperous merchant might own none. It is worth pausing on what this meant for knowledge. Knowledge in medieval Europe did not exist the way we think of it existing. We tend to imagine ideas as free-floating things. Once discovered, they are simply out there in the world, available to anyone who looks. But in the manuscript age, an idea existed only in as many physical copies as had been made of it. If a Greek philosopher had observed something true about the natural world, and if that observation had been written down, And if that text had been copied a dozen times over the centuries, and those copies had survived fire and flood and the ordinary entropy of time, then the idea existed in perhaps a dozen places, probably all of them inside monasteries. If all 12 copies happened to burn, the idea was gone, not forgotten, gone, as though it had never been thought. This was not a theoretical risk. It happened. The library at Alexandria, the most famous example, though far from the only one, held perhaps 500,000 scrolls at its height, representing the accumulated scholarship of the ancient world, and it was destroyed by fire, whether by accident or intention, depending on which ancient source you believe. Centuries of Greek and Roman knowledge were simply erased. The texts that survived the fall of Rome survived because individual monks in individual monasteries happened to copy them. The works of Virgil, of Cicero, of Euclid. They exist today because someone in a cold room with a candle chose to spend their life writing them down by hand. The Scriptorium was therefore not just a room where books were made. It was the entire infrastructure of human memory, and it was fragile in a way that would be difficult to overstate. A single fire in a single monastery could, and sometimes did, destroy texts that existed nowhere else on earth. The monks who did this work understood its weight. Many of them left small marginal notes in the manuscripts they copied, personal observations that were never meant to be read, but have survived because they were written in permanent ink on durable vellum. One Irish monk, copying a text in the 9th century, wrote in the margin, "New vellum, bad ink, I say nothing more." Another wrote, "The parchment is hairy." Another, "Oh, my hand." These small complaints across the centuries feel very close. The work was physically demanding. The sustained concentration required to copy text without errors for 6 or 8 hours a day in poor light, with a quill that needed constant recutting, produced headaches and eye strain and cramped hands that monks wrote about with a kind of weary humor that has not aged at all. And errors were inevitable, not because the monks were careless. Most were extraordinarily careful, but because copying by hand over long periods under candlelight in a second or third language is simply a process in which errors accumulate. A copyist might misread a word, or his eye might slip from one line to the next and skip a phrase, or he might correct what he genuinely believed was an error in his source text, introducing a new one in its place. Each copy was therefore slightly different from the last. Over several generations of copying, a text copied from a copy of a copy of a copy, the differences could become substantial. Scholars who study medieval manuscripts spend careers untangling these chains of variation, trying to work back toward what the original text might have said. The illuminated manuscript, the kind you see in museums, with its intricate borders of gold leaf and tiny painted figures in jewel colors, was the pinnacle of this tradition. The pigments used were extraordinary, ultramarine blue ground from lapis lazuli imported from Afghanistan, vermilion red from a mercury compound called cinnabar, gold leaf beaten thin enough to be translucent. The most elaborate manuscripts were objects of such beauty that they were treated as sacred in themselves, kept in locked chests, brought out only for feast days, shown to visitors as one of the treasures of the house. They were also, in a certain sense, invisible. A manuscript locked in a chest in a monastery in Northumbria was not contributing to the intellectual life of a scholar in Florence. It existed, but it was not accessible. The movement of knowledge in the medieval world was extraordinarily slow. A scholar who wished to read a particular text might have to travel hundreds of miles to the monastery that owned it, or arrange for a copy to be made and sent, a process that could take years and cost a small fortune. Who could read in this world? The question is complicated. Literacy in the modern sense, the ability to read and write fluently in one's own language, was rare outside the clergy. Monks and priests were literate almost by definition, since their vocation required the reading of scripture and liturgy. Some members of the aristocracy could read, particularly women of high birth who had been educated in convents. Merchants in the larger cities were often functionally literate in the practical sense. They could read contracts and account books. But this was a different skill from the deep literacy required to engage with a philosophical or theological text. The vast majority of people, somewhere between 80 and 90% of the European population by most estimates, could not read at all. This was not considered a deficiency or a failure. It was simply the condition of the world. Knowledge came through the spoken word, through sermons, through songs, through the stories told around fires in the long winter evenings, through the images carved into the stone of cathedral doorways, which were themselves a kind of book for those who could not read the written ones. The church understood this and worked with it. The great cathedrals were visual encyclopedias, their stained glass and carved stone narrating the whole of sacred history for a congregation that arrived unable to read a single word of the Latin Mass they heard but could follow every scene in the windows above them. This world had its own coherence, its own deep logic. It was not simply a failed version of the world that came after it. It was a world organized around different assumptions. That knowledge was sacred and therefore rare, that authority derived from tradition and from the church, that the correct relationship between a person and truth was one of patient reception rather than active inquiry. You did not discover truth. You received it through Scripture, through the teachings of the church, through the accumulated wisdom of the fathers who had come before. It was a world of extraordinary patience. The monk who spent 30 years copying manuscripts was not wasting his life. He was participating in the long, slow transmission of sacred knowledge across time, a work as important and as holy as prayer. The illuminator who spent a week on a single letter was not being inefficient. He was offering his skill to God, making the word of Scripture as beautiful as human hands could make it. And it was, for all its beauty and its genuine intellectual richness, a world that rested on an extremely narrow foundation. The number of people who could create new knowledge, who could read and write and reason and argue, was vanishingly small. The channels through which ideas could move were few and slow. The system had no redundancy, no resilience against catastrophe. It worked, and it worked for centuries in its unhurried way. But it was, without knowing it, waiting for something to break it open. That something was already being built in a workshop in the city of Mainz, beside the slow grey river Rhine. Johannes Gutenberg was not, in any obvious sense, a revolutionary. He was a craftsman, a goldsmith, trained in the working of metals, with a goldsmith's particular sensitivity to the behavior of alloys. The way different proportions of different metals change the melting point, the hardness, the flow of the molten material. He was born in Mainz, probably sometime around the year 1395, the son of a patrician family with connections to the ecclesiastical mint. He grew up around the smell of hot metal and the sound of hammers on small, precise work. He was also, by all accounts, secretive. The documentary record of his life is frustratingly thin. We know he was in Strasbourg in the 1430s, where he was involved in some kind of commercial venture that he kept carefully hidden from his business partners. A lawsuit from that period reveals, in fragments, that he was experimenting with a press of some kind and with something called a secret, that his partners were desperate to learn. He returned to Mainz sometime around 1440 and continued his experiments there in a workshop he rented from a local monastery. What he was trying to do, and what he eventually achieved, was not a single invention, but a system, a series of separate technical problems, each of which had to be solved correctly for the whole thing to work. It is worth going through each of these problems in detail, because each one represents a genuine piece of ingenuity, and because the whole system is more elegant than it first appears. The first problem was the type itself. To print a page of text, you need individual letters that can be arranged into words and lines and then rearranged to make a different page. The idea of movable type, individual characters that could be composed and recomposed, was not new. Chinese printers had been using movable type made from baked clay since the 11th century, and Korean printers had been using metal movable type since at least the 13th century. The Korean metal type was, in many ways, technically impressive. But it had not transformed Korean or Chinese society in the way Gutenberg's invention would transform Europe, and the reason for this is partly linguistic and partly mechanical. Chinese and Korean writing systems require thousands of individual characters to represent the full range of meaning in the language. A European alphabetic language, by contrast, requires only 20 or 30 distinct letter shapes, plus punctuation and numerals. 2 marks. To print a page of Chinese text from movable type, a compositor might need to select from a collection of 10,000 individual characters. To print a page of Latin or German text, the same compositor needs perhaps 200 pieces of type, 26 letters in upper and lower case, some punctuation, some common ligatures where 2 letters are joined. The difference in complexity is not a factor of 2 or 3, it is a factor of hundreds. European alphabetic writing was, almost accidentally, perfectly suited to movable type in a way that logographic writing systems were not. But even with only 200 characters to manage, Gutenberg still needed to produce those characters in enormous quantities, enough identical copies of each letter to set an entire page of text, which might require dozens of instances of the letter E alone. And each letter needed to be exactly the same height and width as every other letter, so that when they were locked together in a frame, they would form a perfectly flat, perfectly even surface. If any letter were even slightly taller than its neighbors, it would receive more pressure from the press and print darker. If shorter, it would barely print at all. This is where Gutenberg's goldsmith training became decisive. He developed what is now called the hand mold, a small, adjustable metal device that could be held in one hand and used to cast individual letters quickly and precisely. The mold had a cavity at the bottom shaped like the letter to be cast, and the metal was poured in from the top. When it cooled and solidified, the mold was opened and the letter dropped out, ready to be used. The metal he chose for this casting was the second great technical achievement. Pure lead would have been too soft. It would have worn down after a few hundred impressions. Pure tin would have been too brittle. Gutenberg settled on an alloy, a mixture of lead, tin, and a third metal called antimony. The specific proportions he used, which scholars have estimated from surviving early type, were roughly 80% lead, 5% tin, and 15% antimony. This particular combination has properties that are almost uncannily suited to the task. The antimony causes the alloy to expand slightly as it cools, which means it fills the mold completely and produces a sharp, precise letter face. The alloy melts at a relatively low temperature, around 250 degrees Celsius compared to the 327 degrees required for pure lead, which means it can be cast quickly and economically. And once solid, it is hard enough to survive thousands of impressions before wearing smooth. The result was that Gutenberg could cast individual letters by the hundreds, quickly, cheaply, and with a precision that was consistent enough to produce even lines of text. A skilled typecaster working with a hand mold could produce perhaps 100 individual letters per hour. A complete fount of type, enough to set several pages of text simultaneously, might require 20 or 30,000 individual pieces. It was weeks of casting work, but once done, it could be used indefinitely, and the same type could be melted down and recast if needed. The third problem was the ink. This may sound trivial, but it was not. The water-based inks used for writing on vellum or paper would not adhere properly to metal. They beaded off the smooth surface of the type the way water beads off a waxed surface. You can see this for yourself if you ever try to write on a piece of metal with an ordinary pen. The ink simply will not grip. Gutenberg needed an ink that would coat the metal type evenly, transfer cleanly to the paper or vellum under pressure, and dry quickly enough that the sheets could be stacked without smearing. He developed an oil-based ink, almost certainly derived from the linseed or walnut oils used by painters, thickened with lampblack, the fine carbon soot collected from burning oil lamps to produce a dense, rich black. Oil-based ink is viscous and sticky in a way that water-based ink is not. It wets metal surfaces readily, gripping the raised face of the type letter while leaving the recessed areas ink-free. Under pressure, it transfers to paper with a clean, sharp edge. And the oil carrier dries through a chemical process called oxidative polymerization. The oil molecules react with oxygen in the air and link together into a hard, durable film. Rather than simply evaporating the way water-based ink does, the result is a printed impression that is both sharp and permanent. The fourth problem was the press itself. Here, Gutenberg was on familiar ground. Screw presses, devices in which a large wooden or metal screw is turned to bring a flat plate down onto a surface below, had been used for centuries to press grapes for wine and olives for oil. They were common objects in the Rhineland, where Gutenberg grew up. The principle was simple. Turn the screw, the plate descends, pressure is applied evenly across the whole surface. What Gutenberg needed to adapt was the precision of the application. A wine press could be rough. The grapes did not care if the pressure was slightly uneven. A printing press needed to apply exactly the right amount of pressure, enough to transfer the ink cleanly from type to paper, but not so much that the type was driven into the paper, distorting the letters and blurring the edges. He solved this partly through the mechanism of the press itself, adding a system to control the depth of the platen's descent, and partly through a device called the tympan, a frame covered with stretched cloth or parchment on which the paper was laid before printing. The tympan held the paper in precise registration with the type below, ensuring that each sheet was printed in exactly the same position, and the soft surface of the tympan allowed the paper to press evenly against even the slight irregularities in the type surface. The full process of printing a page, once all these elements were in place, went something like this. The compositor, the person who set the type, would take individual letters from a wooden tray called a typecase, arrange them in a small handheld device called a composing stick, and build up lines of text one at a time. When enough lines had been composed to fill a page, they were transferred to a flat wooden frame called a chase and locked in place with wedges. The chase was then placed on the bed of the press. An assistant called the beater would take 2 large ink balls, pads of leather stuffed with wool, and work them against each other to distribute the ink evenly, then press them firmly against the type, coating the raised letter faces with a thin, even layer. The sheet of paper or vellum was laid on the tympan. The tympan was folded down over the type, and the pressman turned the screw, bringing the platen down with a single firm pull of the bar. The screw was then reversed, the tympan lifted, and the printed sheet peeled carefully away. Setting the type for a single page might take a full day. Printing that page, once the type was set, might take a few minutes per copy. This was the economic revolution concealed inside the mechanical one. The labor was front-loaded into the preparation, and then the same page could be reproduced dozens or hundreds of times at very little additional cost per copy. A single compositor and a single pressman working together could produce something in the region of 250 to 300 finished pages per day. To put that in perspective, a skilled monastic scribe working at full concentration might produce 3 or 4 complete pages per day. The press was not twice as fast or 10 times as fast. It was 100 times as fast or more. Gutenberg spent the better part of a decade developing and refining this system before he felt confident enough to use it for a major project. He had a financier by this point, a wealthy Mainz merchant named Johann Fust, who had lent him the considerable sum of 800 guilders and then another 800 to fund the development of his press and the casting of his type. The interest was accumulating. The pressure to produce something saleable was real. The project he chose was the Bible. It was the obvious choice, in a way that requires a moment's thought to appreciate. The Bible was the single text that every church, every monastery, every cathedral, every institution of any religious significance in Europe needed to own. It was the largest and most complex book in common use, which meant it would demonstrate the capabilities of his press more fully than any shorter work. And it was the text whose production he had spent years observing, the manuscripts he had grown up around in a city full of ecclesiastical institutions were predominantly Bibles or parts of Bibles. He knew what a Bible was supposed to look like. He knew what quality was expected. The work began around 1452, and here the story takes its first quiet turn towards sadness. In 1455, with the Bible nearly complete, Johann Fust called in his loan. The sum owed, with accumulated interest, was now over 2,000 guilders, a debt Gutenberg could not pay. Fust took him to court and won. He took possession of the printing equipment, the type, and the workshop. He continued the business with his own son-in-law, Peter Schoeffer, who had been one of Gutenberg's most skilled compositors. Together, Fust and Schoeffer went on to become prosperous and celebrated printers. Their names appear proudly on the books they published. Gutenberg's name appears on almost nothing. He continued printing in some form. There is evidence of his involvement in other projects in Mainz in the years that followed, but he never recovered his original workshop, and he died around 1468, probably in modest circumstances. Near the end of his life, the Archbishop of Mainz granted him a small pension and a ceremonial court appointment, which suggests he was being cared for rather than celebrated. The man who had changed the world more profoundly than almost any individual in the history of human communication died without wealth, without a press of his own, without a single book that bore his name on its title page. There is something very still about that. A man who gave the world a gift it did not yet understand and who received almost nothing back from it. The gift went on without him, as gifts sometimes do. The Bible that emerged from Gutenberg's workshop, or from Fust and Schoeffer's workshop, depending on which point in its production you mark as the critical one, is one of the most studied physical objects in the history of Western civilization. It is known as the Gutenberg Bible, or sometimes as the 42-line Bible, because each column of text contains 42 lines. It is also sometimes called the B42, with the slightly clinical shorthand of bibliography. Whatever you call it, it is extraordinary. It has 1,286 pages. Each page is printed in 2 columns, in a Gothic typeface called Textura that Gutenberg had designed to mimic the hand of a skilled German scribe, close-set, formal, dense, and beautiful. The type is so consistent that scholars who first examined early copies in the 18th century refused to believe it had been printed mechanically. They assumed it must be a very fine manuscript. Each page is printed with a precision that no human hand could have achieved. Every line the same length, every letter the same height, the spacing between words perfectly uniform. It is the uniformity that gives it away in the end. Human hands, however skilled, always vary slightly. The press does not vary at all. Approximately 180 copies were produced over a period of roughly 4 to 5 years, between about 1452 and 1455. Some were printed on paper, others, perhaps 45 of them, on vellum. A vellum copy of the complete Bible required approximately 170 calfskins. The paper copies were slightly less expensive to produce, though still a significant investment. Each finished copy weighed around 60 pounds, about the weight of a large dog or a small child. Now consider what it would have taken to produce those same 180 copies by hand. A skilled monastic scribe, working full days, might complete 1 copy of the Bible in approximately a year and a half to 2 years. To produce 180 copies simultaneously, you would need somewhere between 180 and 360 scribes, all working in parallel for the same duration. No monastery in Europe had that many scribes. No institution in Europe had that many scribes. The combined scriptoria of the entire continent, working on nothing else, might have struggled to produce 180 Bibles in less than a decade. Gutenberg's workshop, with perhaps 20 workers and a small number of presses, did it in 4 or 5 years. The copies were sold before they were finished. We know this from a remarkable letter written in March of 1455 by a future pope, Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, who would later become Pius II, who had seen some of the printed sheets at the trade fair in Frankfurt. He wrote to a cardinal that he had seen and partly read portions of a Bible produced by a new and wonderful method in Mainz, and that the text was so clear and legible that one could read it without spectacles. He noted that all the copies had already been spoken for and that he had not been able to obtain one. The first print run of the Gutenberg Bible sold out before it was complete. The price was somewhere between 30 and 50 guilders for a paper copy, a significant sum, roughly equivalent to a skilled craftsman's wages for 2 or 3 months, but dramatically less than the cost of a handwritten Bible. And crucially, every copy was identical. There were no scribal variations, no accumulated errors, no passages where the copyist's eye had slipped. If you owned a Gutenberg Bible and your neighbor owned a Gutenberg Bible, you both owned the same text. Of those original 180 or so copies, 49 survive today, scattered across libraries and museums on several continents. Some are complete, some are fragments. Each one has been studied with extraordinary care. The paper copies can be dated by the watermarks in the paper. Each paper mill used a distinctive watermark pressed into the wet pulp during manufacture, and these marks can be matched to records of when particular mills were active. The vellum copies can be analyzed for the quality and preparation of the skin. Together, these physical clues allow scholars to reconstruct the sequence of printing, to identify which sheets were printed first and which last, even to detect moments when the typesetters changed their minds and adjusted the layout partway through the print run. The Gutenberg Bible was, then, both a technical achievement and a commercial one, but the full weight of what had happened in that workshop did not become apparent until the years that followed, when the technology began to spread. It spread with a speed that was, by the standards of the time, astonishing. Printing establishments appeared in Strasbourg by 1460, in Cologne and Basel by 1464, in Rome by 1467, in Venice by 1469, in Paris by 1470, in Krakow and Budapest by 1473, in Westminster, which would become London. By 1476, when William Caxton set up the first press in England. By the year 1500, printing presses had been established in roughly 270 cities across Europe. The technology had spread from a single workshop in Mainz to nearly every major city on the continent in less than 50 years. This period, from the Gutenberg Bible in the mid-1450s to the year 1500, has a name in the history of books. The books produced in this period are called incunabula, from the Latin word for cradle, meaning the cradle period of printing, the infancy of the new technology. It is a word that carries a certain tenderness, and it is well chosen. These were the first tentative steps of something that would eventually become so powerful and so pervasive that we can barely see it anymore, the way you cannot see the water you swim in. The incunabula period produced approximately 40,000 distinct editions of books. Scholars have estimated that the total number of individual copies printed, the actual physical volumes, was somewhere between 8 and 12 million. 9 million is the figure most commonly cited. 9 million books in Europe by the year 1500. The entire manuscript tradition of the previous 1,000 years had produced perhaps 100,000 volumes, most of them still sitting in the libraries of monasteries and cathedrals. In 50 years, print had multiplied the number of books in Europe by a factor of nearly 100. What were people printing? everything. The Bible, naturally, it remained the single most printed text throughout the incunabular period and long beyond it, but also classical Latin texts, Virgil, Cicero, Caesar, Ovid, Greek texts in Latin translation, Aristotle, Euclid, Galen, legal texts, the Corpus Juris Civilis, the great Roman law code that underpinned the legal systems of most of Europe, medical texts, philosophical texts, and, increasingly, texts in vernacular languages, Italian, German, French, English, rather than in Latin alone. There is a curious and counterintuitive episode in the middle of this story. In the 1460s and 1470s, just as printing was beginning to establish itself across Europe, the production of handwritten manuscripts actually increased. For a decade or two, the two technologies coexisted and even competed, and the manuscript trade briefly flourished. The reason appears to be partly that the new printed books created demand for books, generally. They made people aware of texts they had not previously known existed, and some of those texts were not yet available in print, so readers sought them in manuscript form. And partly it was a question of status. There was, among the wealthy collectors who had always been the primary market for luxury manuscripts, a genuine disdain for printed books. Federico da Montefeltro, the Duke of Urbino, one of the great bibliophiles of the 15th century, was said to have refused to allow a single printed book into his famous library. He considered them vulgar, mass-produced objects, lacking the individuality and the craft of a hand-copied manuscript. He was not alone in this view. For a certain class of collector, a printed book was what a mass-produced painting would be to someone who collected originals, technically functional, but missing something essential. This aristocratic resistance did not last long. By the 1480s and 1490s, manuscript production was collapsing almost entirely, driven out of the market by the sheer economic advantage of print. A book that could be produced in hundreds of identical copies at a fraction of the cost of a single manuscript was simply too powerful a competitor. The wealthy collectors continued to commission illuminated manuscripts for prestige purposes. They still do, in a sense, in the form of limited edition, fine press books, but the working library, the collection of texts meant to be read and consulted and argued with, was becoming a collection of printed books. By 1500, the 9 million printed books in Europe represented something genuinely new in human history. Knowledge was no longer a scarce resource. It was still not cheap by modern standards. A printed book was not something a peasant farmer could afford. But it was within reach of a merchant, a lawyer, a physician, a prosperous craftsman, a clergyman of modest means. The audience for the written word had expanded dramatically, and it was about to expand further. 9 million books. The number sits quietly in the air. Each one a small act of multiplication, a thought copied and sent out into the world, arriving in hands that had never held a book before. In the year 1468, an Italian scholar named Giovanni Andrea Bussi, he was the Bishop of Illyria and one of the early enthusiasts of the new printing technology, wrote a letter in which he described something he had personally witnessed and found remarkable. He noted that a work of scholarship which, before the press, would have cost more than 100 florins, could now be purchased for 20, and a work that had previously cost 20 florins could now be had for 4 at most. He was describing, in the careful language of a man who dealt in books, a price reduction of roughly 80% within a single generation. To understand what that number means, it helps to anchor it in something concrete. A florin was a gold coin, roughly equivalent in purchasing power to a skilled craftsman's daily wage. 100 florins was, therefore, roughly 100 days of skilled labor, more than 3 months of wages for a single book. Even at 20 florins, a book was a significant purchase, something you saved for and considered carefully. At 4 florins, it was the equivalent of perhaps 4 days' wages. Still not trivial, but within the reach of a far wider range of people. The mechanism behind this collapse in price is worth tracing carefully because it operates at several levels simultaneously, and each level reinforces the others. The most obvious level is simple: economics of scale. When a printer sets the type for a page and locks it into the press, the cost of that labor is fixed regardless of how many copies are printed. The first copy costs, say, a day of typesetting labor plus materials. The second copy costs only the paper and ink. The 100th copy costs almost nothing beyond paper and ink. The average cost per copy therefore falls rapidly as the print run increases. A manuscript, by contrast, costs the same to produce whether it is the first copy or the 10th. Each one requires the same number of hours of scribal labor. There is no economy of scale in hand copying. There is only repetition. But the economic transformation went deeper than price per copy. There is a second mechanism operating here, one that is less obvious but equally important: the elimination of scribal error. Every time a text was copied by hand, small errors crept in. Over multiple generations of copying, these errors accumulated. A scholar working with a manuscript text could never be entirely certain whether what he was reading was what the original author had written, or whether it was a version that had drifted through a chain of small mistakes away from the original. This uncertainty was not merely an inconvenience. It was a fundamental obstacle to the kind of cumulative intellectual work that we now take for granted. If two scholars in different cities were reading different manuscript copies of the same text and those copies disagreed with each other in important passages, they could not simply compare their readings and correct the error. They had no way of knowing which copy was closer to the original or whether either was. Printing solved this problem in a single stroke. Every copy of a printed edition was identical to every other copy of the same edition. If a scholar in Paris and a scholar in Vienna both owned the same printed edition of Aristotle's Physics, they were reading exactly the same words. They could cite the same page numbers. They could argue about the same passage without first having to establish what the passage actually said. This sounds like a small thing. It was not. It was the foundation on which systematic, cumulative scholarship became possible. There is a third mechanism, quieter than the others, but perhaps the most far-reaching: the standardization of language. Before the press, written language in Europe was not standardized in the way we now take for granted. English, in the 15th century, was not one language, but a collection of regional dialects that varied so widely that a speaker from London might struggle to read a document from the north of England, even though both were technically writing English. The same was true of French, of German, of Italian. Each region had its own spellings, its own grammatical conventions, its own vocabulary for common things. Printers, for purely practical reasons, had to choose. When you are setting type, you must commit to a single spelling of every word. You cannot hedge between two regional variants. The letter is either an E or an A, and whichever you choose, it will be the same in every copy. Early printers, most of them based in major cities, London, Paris, Frankfurt, Venice, naturally gravitated toward the dialect of their own city, or toward whatever form of the language they judged to be most widely intelligible to the broadest possible audience of buyers. Over time, the spellings and grammatical forms that appeared in printed books began to establish themselves as the standard, simply through repetition and familiarity. If every printed book in England used the same spelling of a word, that spelling gradually became, in the minds of readers, the correct spelling, not because anyone decreed it, but because uniformity has its own authority. The consequences for literacy were significant. When written language is standardized, it becomes easier to learn. A child learning to read in a world where every printed text uses the same spelling and grammar has a much simpler task than a child learning to read in a world where every manuscript might use different conventions. The spread of printing and the gradual standardization of European languages worked together to make literacy more accessible, more learnable, more worth the effort of acquiring. Literacy rates across Europe rose slowly but measurably in the decades following the spread of the press. The change was not immediate. It took generations, and it was not uniform across all regions or all social classes. But the direction of movement was consistent. More people could read in 1520 than in 1450. More could read in 1580 than in 1520. The press did not cause this change on its own. Other factors, including the growth of cities, the expansion of trade, and the emergence of schools and universities, all played their part. But the press was the enabling condition, the thing that made literacy worth acquiring, because it meant that a literate person now had access to a world of texts rather than to a single, carefully guarded manuscript. Consider what this meant for a prosperous merchant in Antwerp or Florence around the year 1500. Before the press, such a man might have been functionally literate, able to read contracts and account books, but would have had access to almost no books. After the press, the same man could own a shelf of books. He could own Cicero and Virgil in Latin, or translations of them into his own language. He could own a printed manual of arithmetic, a geography, a natural history, a book of laws. He could read about the world beyond his own city, about history, about medicine, about the stars. He could encounter ideas that no one in his immediate community had ever heard of, and he could think about them in private, in his own time, without a priest or a teacher present to guide his interpretation. This last point matters more than it might seem. The medieval system of knowledge transmission was not just a matter of who owned books, it was a matter of who interpreted them. Even in the relatively rare cases where a layperson encountered a sacred text, that text was almost always mediated, explained, glossed, contextualized by a clergyman who stood between the reader and the words. The church was not simply the custodian of texts, it was the custodian of meaning. To read the Bible was not simply to read words, it was to receive an authorized interpretation of those words, delivered through the structure of the church. Cheap, widely available books began to dissolve this mediation. Not immediately, not completely, and not without enormous conflict, but the direction of the change was clear. When a person could hold a text in their own hands, read it in their own language, in their own home, without a clerical intermediary present, the relationship between that person and the text was fundamentally different from anything that had been possible before. The knowledge was theirs. The interpretation was theirs to make. This was, for the institutions that had managed knowledge for centuries, a development of enormous consequence, and the consequences would arrive sooner than anyone expected, carried not in a learned treatise, but in a short, sharp document nailed to a church door in a small German town. On the 31st of October, 1517, a 33-year-old professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg posted a document to the door of the castle church. The document was a list of 95 propositions, theses in the academic language of the time, which he wished to debate with his colleagues. The practice of posting such documents was entirely conventional. University doors and church doors served as public notice boards, and a list of propositions for academic debate was a routine form of scholarly communication. Martin Luther was not, on that autumn morning, intending to start a revolution. He was intending to start a conversation. What he was proposing to debate was the practice of indulgences, the Church's system of selling remission of punishment for sins, either for the living or for souls in purgatory. A particularly aggressive indulgence campaign had recently reached the region around Wittenberg, run by a Dominican friar named Johann Tetzel, whose sales pitch was memorable in its directness: a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. Luther found this offensive, both theologically and morally. His 95 theses were a careful, scholarly critique of the indulgence system, written in Latin, addressed to his academic peers. Within 2 weeks, copies of the theses had spread across Germany. Within a month, they had reached Rome. Within a year, they had been read across most of Europe. This would not have been possible at any previous point in human history. A document posted on a church door in a provincial German town would normally have been read by a handful of passers-by, discussed locally for a few weeks, and then forgotten. The ideas it contained might eventually have found their way into correspondence, into a manuscript that was slowly copied and slowly distributed, a process measured in years, not weeks. By the time the ideas arrived anywhere significant, they would have been stripped of their urgency, absorbed into the slow metabolism of manuscript culture where everything moved at the pace of a horse carrying a saddlebag of letters. The printing press changed the time scale entirely. Luther's theses were quickly translated from Latin into German, set in type and printed. Multiple printers in multiple cities produced their own editions independently without Luther's knowledge or permission. The text was short enough, 95 numbered propositions, to fit on a single large sheet, the kind that could be printed quickly and sold cheaply. Within weeks of their composition, the theses existed in thousands of copies in both Latin and German in cities across the German-speaking world. Luther recognized what had happened, and he recognized it as something new. In a letter written in 1518, he expressed genuine astonishment at the speed of the dissemination. He had not intended the theses for a general audience, he wrote. He had addressed them to a small circle of scholars. But they had, as he put it, flown beyond his control. He was describing, for the first time in recorded history, something that we would now recognize as a viral phenomenon, an idea spreading faster than its author could follow, carried by a technology that had no respect for the boundaries the author had imagined. In 1518 and 1519, Luther became the most published author on the European continent. This is not a figure of speech or an approximation, it is a measurable fact. The number of books and pamphlets published in Germany in those 2 years included Luther's works in proportions that dwarfed every other author. Between 1518 and 1520, his tracts and treatises reached an estimated 300,000 printed copies. 300,000. The entire manuscript production of a large European monastery over a century might have amounted to a few hundred volumes. Luther's ideas, in 2 years, had been reproduced more than 300,000 times. The Church had faced heretics before. It had faced challenging ideas, dissenting theologians, reforming movements. It had dealt with all of them by the same method: identify the dissenter, summon them to recant, and if they refused, excommunicate them and confiscate or destroy their writings. The system worked because manuscripts were physical objects, present in known locations, movable only at the speed of a horse. If you knew where the manuscripts were, you could burn them. If you burned them, the ideas they contained were effectively suppressed, at least for a generation. Print made this strategy obsolete overnight. By the time the Church had identified a Lutheran pamphlet in Frankfurt and ordered it confiscated, the same pamphlet had already been printed in Strasbourg, Nuremberg, Leipzig, and Cologne. By the time it had been suppressed in Germany, it had been printed in the Netherlands and Switzerland. The Church was trying to hold back water with its hands. Every copy it burned had already produced a dozen more, and those were already in the hands of readers who had already read them. Luther understood this perfectly, and he used it deliberately. He was a gifted writer, passionate, direct, often funny, sometimes savage, and he understood the new medium in a way that his opponents did not. He wrote in German as well as Latin, addressing himself not only to scholars, but to ordinary literate people, merchants, craftsmen, minor clergy, educated townspeople. He developed a pamphlet as a form, short, cheap, written in the language people actually spoke, making complex theological arguments in terms that a person of ordinary education could follow. His pamphlet, On the Freedom of a Christian, published in 1520, is a masterpiece of this form, 10,000 words, clear as water, arguing that salvation comes through faith alone and not through the institutional machinery of the Church. And then there was the Bible. In 1522, Luther published his translation of the New Testament into German. Not the formal, elevated German of the educated elite, but the living German of the market and the street, what he called the language of the mother at home, the children in the street, the common man in the marketplace. He spent years on the translation, traveling through German towns and listening to how people actually spoke, testing his phrasing against the ear of an ordinary listener rather than the eye of a scholar. The effect of placing the Bible in the hands of German readers in their own language was profound in ways that went beyond theology. The medieval church had always been, among other things, an interpretive institution. The Bible existed in Latin, a language that most lay people could not read, and its meaning was conveyed to them through the preaching of priests and the teachings of theologians. The church stood between the text and the reader, mediating, explaining, authorizing. When Luther put the Bible into German, he dissolved that mediation. Any literate German could now read the text themselves, form their own interpretation, and judge for themselves whether the church's teachings matched what was written. This was not merely a theological development, it was a political one. The authority of any institution rests, in part, on its monopoly over certain kinds of knowledge. The Church's authority rested partly on its monopoly over the interpretation of Scripture. Once that monopoly was broken, once ordinary people could read the same text the priests were reading and draw their own conclusions, the institutional authority of the Church was permanently compromised. Not destroyed, it survived and adapted, but it was never again the sole arbiter of Christian truth. The pamphlet as a form deserves its own moment here, because it was genuinely new. Before the press, there was no equivalent, no cheap, short, widely distributed vehicle for a single person's opinion on a current controversy. The pamphlet was the first mass medium in the modern sense, disposable, topical, written for immediate effect, designed to be read once and passed on. In the years after 1517, pamphlets proliferated across Germany in their thousands. Not only Luther's, but those of his supporters, his opponents, his imitators, his critics. The public sphere of political and religious debate, which had previously existed only in the controlled environments of the university and the church council, suddenly spilled out into the streets. It is worth sitting with the strangeness of what had happened. A goldsmith's workshop in Mainz, somewhere around 1440, had invented a technology for reproducing text efficiently. The man who invented it had died in modest circumstances, his name on nothing. And yet the technology he built, within 60 years of his death, had fractured the religious unity of a continent that had been, in some form, unified under a single church for 1,000 years. The Protestant Reformation, with all its theological richness and all its violence and all its lasting consequences for the shape of the modern world, was not caused by the printing press. It was caused by genuine theological conviction, by corruption, by long simmering resentments about church authority and church wealth. But without the press, it would have been a local controversy, suppressed within a generation. With the press, it became permanent and irreversible. A goldsmith's workshop, a lead tin antimony alloy with a low melting point, a screw press adapted from the wine trade, and a continent changed forever. In the years between 1450 and 1550, something happened to the relationship between scholars and knowledge that had no real precedent in human history. Scholars in different cities who had never met and might never meet began to read the same books. Not similar books, or books on similar subjects, but literally the same texts, the same edition with the same page numbers, the same diagrams, the same errors and the same corrections. For the first time, it was possible for a community of thinkers spread across thousands of miles to argue from a genuinely shared foundation. This community had a name, coined by the scholars themselves, the Republic of Letters. It was a republic in the most literal sense, a self-governing community of equals, bound not by geography or political allegiance, but by shared intellectual commitment, communicating through printed books and through the letters that those books inspired. Its citizens were scholars, physicians, mathematicians, natural philosophers, what we would now call scientists. and they were scattered from Edinburgh to Naples, from Lisbon to Krakow. What held them together was print. To understand why this mattered so much for the development of science, it helps to think about what science actually requires. Science is not simply the act of making observations, it is the act of making observations that can be verified by others, combined with the observations of others, built upon by still others, corrected when wrong and confirmed when right. A single person observing nature in isolation can produce interesting data, but not science in the modern sense. Science requires a community that can share findings, dispute interpretations, and accumulate knowledge over time. The manuscript world had communities of scholars, but they were small, local, and slow. A scholar in Oxford might correspond by letter with a scholar in Paris, but the letters took weeks to arrive and described findings in words rather than showing them. A diagram sent by letter had to be copied by hand, and the copy might be less accurate than the original. A table of numbers might contain transcription errors. The community of scholars existed, but it was thin and unreliable, and its ability to share complex information was severely limited. Print changed this at the most fundamental level. Consider the problem of an astronomical observation. An astronomer in Nuremberg, observing the position of a planet on a particular night, produces a measurement. For that measurement to be useful to the broader community of astronomers, it needs to be compared with measurements made by other observers on the same night in other locations. Before print, this comparison was nearly impossible. The astronomer's notes were handwritten, unique, and could be shared only by sending the original or making a copy. After print, the same astronomer could publish his measurements in a printed table that was distributed to hundreds of other astronomers across Europe. Those astronomers could then compare their own observations against his, identify discrepancies, and through the process of comparison, arrive at a more accurate picture of the planet's actual position than any single observer could have achieved alone. This is the mechanism by which print accelerated science, not by making individual observations more accurate, but by making it possible to combine and compare observations across a community. The accuracy of the community was greater than the accuracy of any individual member, and print was the technology that made the community possible. The recovery and distribution of ancient texts played an important early role in this process. The great texts of Greek and Roman scholarship, Aristotle's works on natural philosophy, Euclid's geometry, Galen's anatomy, Ptolemy's astronomy, had survived the medieval period in manuscript copies, but they were scattered, inconsistent, and often corrupted by centuries of hand copying. The early printers, many of them scholars themselves or working closely with scholars, made the recovery and publication of these texts a priority. Within a few decades of Gutenberg's Bible, printed editions of Aristotle, Euclid, Galen, and Ptolemy were circulating across Europe in thousands of copies, each copy identical to the others, each text more carefully edited and corrected than any manuscript version had been. This was not simply a matter of making old texts more widely available. It was a matter of making them contestable. When every scholar in Europe is reading the same edition of Galen's anatomy, and that edition contains a description of a blood vessel that does not match what the scholar actually sees when he dissects a human body, the discrepancy becomes visible in a way it could not have been before. A manuscript copy of Galen might contain errors introduced by scribes over centuries. How would you know whether the discrepancy was in Galen's original text or in your own observation? When the baseline was reliable, discrepancies between the text and the observed world became meaningful rather than merely suspect. Andreas Vesalius, the Flemish anatomist who published his great work on human anatomy in 1543, worked in exactly this way. He had been trained in the tradition of Galen, the Greek physician whose anatomical texts had been the foundation of European medicine for over 1,000 years. But Vesalius dissected human bodies, a practice that had become more common in the Italian universities, and what he saw in the bodies did not always match what Galen described. The difference was not trivial. Galen had described the anatomy of animals, particularly pigs and monkeys, and extrapolated to humans, and in several important places he was simply wrong about human anatomy. The heart does not have pores in the wall between its two chambers, as Galen had claimed. The liver does not have 5 lobes. The jaw is a single bone, not 2. Vesalius published his corrections in a printed book, the Fabrica, with extraordinarily detailed woodcut illustrations, anatomical diagrams of a quality and accuracy that had never been produced before, showing the human body layer by layer, muscles and bones and organs laid out with a precision that was only possible because the illustrator was working from actual dissected specimens rather than from earlier images. The book was printed in Basel and distributed across Europe. Within years, physicians and anatomists in Paris and Padua and London were all working from the same images, arguing about the same diagrams, correcting their own observations against the same printed baseline. This is what Francis Bacon meant when, writing in 1620, he named the printing press alongside the compass and gunpowder as the 3 inventions that had done more to change the world than any empire or philosophy. Bacon was one of the early architects of what we now call the scientific method, the idea that knowledge should be built on systematic observation and experiment rather than on the authority of ancient texts. He understood, with unusual clarity, that this kind of knowledge building was only possible within a community, and that the community was only possible because of print. The compass had opened the world to navigation. Gunpowder had changed the nature of warfare. But the press had changed the nature of knowledge itself, had made it cumulative, collective, and self-correcting in a way it had never been before. The printing of scientific and mathematical tables is worth lingering on because it illustrates the mechanism with particular clarity. Before print, a table of astronomical positions, or of trigonometric values, or of logarithms had to be copied by hand. Hand copying a table of numbers is an error-prone process. A single transposed digit can produce errors that propagate through any calculation that relies on the table. Printed tables, produced from carefully checked typeset originals, were far more reliable. When errors were found, and they were found because hundreds of scholars were now using the same table and comparing their results, they could be corrected in the next edition, and that corrected edition would again be distributed in hundreds of identical copies. There is something deeply beautiful in this process, if you let yourself see it. Knowledge moving across distances, arriving in the hands of people who would never meet, being tested and corrected and improved and sent back out again. A physician in Padua and a physician in Paris, arguing from the same diagram. An astronomer in Krakow and an astronomer in Nuremberg, comparing observations made on the same night. Strangers, building something together across centuries as well as miles. The Republic of Letters was not utopian. It had its disputes, its egos, its bitter priority arguments, its exclusions. Women were largely absent from it, as from most intellectual life of the period. But it was, for all its limitations, something genuinely new in the history of human thought. A community that transcended geography, built from shared texts, sustained by the quiet miracle of identical copies. All of it resting on a goldsmith's alloy and a screw press and an oil-based ink. There is a transformation worked by the printing press that is quieter than the Reformation and less dramatic than the scientific revolution, but in some ways more fundamental to the shape of the world we live in now. It is the transformation of language, and through language, the transformation of identity. To understand what the press did to language, you need to hold in mind how different language looked in the 15th century from how it looks now. We are accustomed to the idea that English is English, that German is German, that French is French, that these are stable, defined entities with correct spellings and standard grammars, the same from one end of the country to the other. This stability is so familiar that it feels natural, as though languages were always this way. They were not. In the England of 1450, a document written in London and a document written in the north of Yorkshire were both technically English, but the gap between them, in spelling, in vocabulary, in grammatical forms, was so wide that a reader familiar with one might struggle significantly with the other. The word for church might be spelled kirk in the north and churchy in the south. The word for the plural of eye might be iron in one region and eyes in another. The verb forms, the pronouns, the prepositions, all of these varied from region to region in ways that reflected centuries of separate development, of Norse influence in the north and Norman French influence in the south, of different patterns of settlement and trade. There were English dialects, mutually intelligible in conversation but diverging significantly in their written forms. The situation was similar across Europe. German was a family of related dialects, High German in the south, Low German in the north, Middle German in between, that shaded into each other across the landscape without any clear boundary. A speaker from Bavaria and a speaker from Hamburg could communicate with effort, but their written languages were as different as their accents. French showed similar regional variation, as did Italian, Spanish, and the other vernacular languages of Europe. Printers had to choose. This is the key point, and it is worth dwelling on. When you set type, you choose a spelling. Every time you set the word for bread, or church, or love, or death, you commit to one form. You cannot hedge. You cannot use the regional variant in one copy and the city form in another. You are producing hundreds of identical copies, and they will all say the same thing. The choice of spelling is, in a small way, a political act, even if the printer making it is thinking only about which form will be most legible to the widest possible audience of buyers. Early printers, for the most practical of commercial reasons, tended to choose the dialect of the city where they worked, or the dialect that seemed most prestigious and widely understood. In England, William Caxton set up his press in Westminster, in the shadow of the royal court, and the English of his printed books was the educated London English of the late 15th century. Not the English of Chaucer, who had written in a somewhat different form a century earlier, but a more regularized, more standardized form. The English of the Chancery, the royal administration, the legal courts. Over the following decades, as Caxton's press and the presses that followed it produced thousands of books in this form of the language, that form became familiar to literate readers across England. It became, gradually and without anyone decreeing it, the standard. The most dramatic example of this process is Luther's German Bible. Luther was acutely conscious of the challenge he faced. He was translating a sacred text into a language that did not, in any consistent form, exist. There was a collection of dialects, and a reader in Munich and a reader in Hamburg might each find the other's German nearly as foreign as Latin. Luther's solution was deliberate and considered. He studied the language of the imperial chancery, the administrative German used by the Holy Roman Emperor's court, which had developed a form of the language designed to be broadly intelligible across the German-speaking world. He then modified this with the living speech he heard around him, the German of the market and the street, the German that ordinary people actually used in conversation. He tested his phrasing constantly against the ear of uneducated listeners, asking himself whether they would understand, whether the rhythm felt natural, whether the words carried the weight of the original. The result was a German Bible that could be read across the German-speaking world, not perfectly, not identically understood in every region, but recognizably the same language from north to south, from east to west. And because it was the Bible, it was read constantly, memorized in passages, quoted in sermons, recited in homes. Millions of German speakers encountered Luther's German as a touchstone, a shared form of their language that transcended their local dialect. Over generations, the language of Luther's Bible became the foundation of what we now call Standard German. The language of one man's translation, multiplied by the press into millions of identical copies, shaped the tongue of a nation. The scholar Benedict Anderson, writing in the 20th century about the origins of national identity, coined a phrase for what the printing press created: imagined communities. By this he meant that a nation is not a community in the way a village is a community. You cannot know personally all the people who share your nationality. A nation is a community you imagine, a community of people you have never met but with whom you feel connected because you share something essential: a language, a set of stories, a way of describing the world. Before the press, these imagined communities were limited in scale and coherence. After the press, they became vastly more powerful. When a person in Hamburg and a person in Munich both read the same German Bible in the same language, they shared something that transcended the local. They were both, in a meaningful sense, part of the same community of German readers. They might never meet. They might have little else in common. And the language, made uniform by print, was the first thread of what would eventually become national identity. The consequences for the map of Europe were long in arriving, but unmistakable in retrospect. The nation-state, a political unit defined by a shared language and culture rather than by dynastic inheritance or feudal obligation, did not emerge fully until the 19th century. But its foundations were laid in the 15th and 16th centuries when the press began the slow work of standardizing the languages that would eventually define national borders. Germany, France, England, Spain. These became not just political entities but linguistic ones, defined as much by the language spoken within their borders as by the armies that defended those borders. There is a shadow side to this story, and it deserves a moment's acknowledgement. The languages that were standardized by print were the languages that had presses. The languages that had no press, the smaller regional languages, the languages of minority communities, the languages of peoples who lacked the wealth or the political power to establish a printing industry, were not standardized. They did not develop printed literatures. They did not generate the imagined communities that print made possible. And over time, many of them faded, pressed out of use by the dominant printed languages that surrounded them. Welsh survived, partly because it had a press and a printed Bible. Cornish did not survive, and it had neither. The printing press gave enormous power to the languages it touched, and left the languages it did not touch in a more exposed and vulnerable position. This is not a comfortable thought. The same technology that democratized knowledge within the communities it served also, indirectly, disadvantaged the communities it did not serve. Progress rarely distributes its benefits evenly, and the printing press was no exception. But the long movement of it, the way print reached into the very structure of language and identity and began, slowly, to reshape both, is one of the quieter wonders of the whole story. Not a battle or a revolution or a famous name, just a printer choosing a spelling. And that choice, multiplied by hundreds of thousands of copies across decades and generations, becoming the way a language sounds. We have been traveling a long way tonight, through the candlelit scriptoria and the cold stone of monasteries, through the smell of hot metal in a workshop beside the Rhine, through the thunder of pamphlets spreading across a continent, through the quiet revolution of scholars reading the same diagrams in different cities, through the slow fixing of languages into the forms that still shape the borders of our world. We have been following the trail of a single invention, watching it move through history, the way a stone dropped in still water sends rings outward, each ring further from the center, each one changing the surface it crosses. It is worth pausing here near the end of the journey to ask a question that the story so far has perhaps obscured. What exactly was the Middle Ages, the world that the printing press helped to end? Because the answer matters. The medieval world was not simply a darkness waiting to be illuminated. It was a world with its own profound coherence, its own beauty, its own ways of knowing and being that were not merely primitive versions of what came after. The medieval world was organized around faith, not faith as a private opinion held quietly in the heart, but faith as the structure of reality itself, the frame through which every event, every relationship, every piece of knowledge was understood. The universe was not, in the medieval imagination, a collection of physical processes operating according to natural laws. It was a story, told by God, in which every creature and every event had a meaning that pointed beyond itself toward the divine. A comet was not a piece of rock and ice following an elliptical orbit. It was a sign, a communication, a portent. A plague was not the spread of a pathogen through a susceptible population. It was a judgment, or a test, or a call to repentance. This was not ignorance exactly. It was a different epistemology, a different theory of what knowledge is and where it comes from. Within this framework, the manuscript was not merely a container for information. It was a sacred object, the physical embodiment of the Word of God in the case of Scripture, the word of the ancient authorities in the case of philosophy and science. The care with which a manuscript was made, the beauty of its illumination, the precision of its copying, were all expressions of reverence. The scribe who spent months copying a gospel was not simply making a book. He was performing an act of devotion, offering his skill and his time to the service of something he believed to be eternally true. What was lost when this world began to dissolve? Several things, and they are worth naming honestly. The illuminated manuscript as an art form was one of the casualties of the press. Not immediately, and not entirely. The tradition of fine manuscript making continued for decades after Gutenberg, and continues in a limited way even now. But the mass production of printed books made the illuminated manuscript economically unviable as an everyday object. The extraordinary fusion of text and image that characterizes the great manuscripts, the Book of Kells, the Lindisfarne Gospels, the Hours of the Ducterberry, required a level of individual care and artistic attention that simply could not be replicated in a print run. The printed book was uniform and efficient and affordable, and those qualities came at the cost of the hand's particularity. Every copy of a printed book is the same. Every manuscript was, in some small way, unique. Something else was lost, the intimate relationship between a scribe and a text. When you copy a text by hand, you read it at a different depth than when you simply read it. The hand slows the eye. Every sentence must be processed, not just as meaning, but as a sequence of letters that must be formed individually. Scribes who copied texts over years developed a relationship with those texts that was something like memorization, something like prayer, a total absorption in the words that is very different from the rapid reading that print makes possible. The monks who copied manuscripts were not passive conduits. They were active, engaged, sometimes arguing with the text in their marginal notes, sometimes adding glosses that became part of the tradition. The intimacy of that relationship between a single human hand and a single text across months of daily work is something that print, by its nature, cannot provide. And there was the unity of a shared religious culture. Medieval Europe, for all its regional variation and its internal conflicts, was bound together by a single church and a single liturgical language. From Ireland to Poland, from Norway to Sicily, the same Latin Mass was celebrated, the same prayers were spoken, the same calendar of saints was observed. This unity was real, and it provided something genuinely valuable, a sense of membership in a community that transcended the local, that stretched across time as well as space, connecting the living to the dead and to the unborn in a single continuous story. The Reformation, which the press made possible and unstoppable, shattered this unity permanently. Europe has never since been religiously unified, and the wars of religion that followed the Reformation, the 30 Years' War, the French Wars of Religion, the English Civil War, were among the most destructive conflicts in European history. The press did not cause those wars, but it created the conditions in which they became possible. These losses are real. They deserve to be held alongside the gains. And the gains were also real. and also worth naming, what emerged from the long dissolution of the medieval world, not quickly, not cleanly, but over the course of 2 or 3 centuries, was a different kind of human being, the individual reader, the private conscience, the person who could hold a book in their own hands, read it in their own time, form their own interpretation, and decide for themselves what they believed. This is not a small thing. The capacity for private intellectual life, for forming beliefs on the basis of evidence and reasoning, rather than on the authority of an institution, is something we now take entirely for granted, but it had to be created. It was not the natural condition of human beings. It was a historical achievement made possible by a specific technology in a specific place at a specific time. The printing press did not invent the individual conscience, but it gave the individual conscience something to work with. It put text in private hands, and private hands made private minds. The scientist who could build on the published work of strangers, correcting and extending it through their own observations, was another new kind of person. The Republic of Letters was a community of individuals who had never met, linked by shared texts, building something collectively that none of them could have built alone. Modern science, the systematic, cumulative, self-correcting enterprise that has given us medicine and physics and chemistry and the understanding of our own biology, is the direct heir of that community. It could not exist without print. The press was not merely a tool that scientists happened to use, it was the precondition for science as a collective enterprise. And the citizen who could read the law that governed them, who could hold in their hands the printed text of the statutes and decrees that shaped their life, rather than depending on the word of a lord or a priest to know what the law said, was another new kind of person. The connection between the printing press and the eventual development of democratic governance is not direct or simple, but it is real. A population that can read the law is a population that can argue about the law, demand changes to the law, hold its rulers accountable to the law. The Enlightenment, with its arguments for natural rights and limited government and the sovereignty of the people, was built on printed books. The American Declaration of Independence, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. These were printed documents, distributed in thousands of copies, read by thousands of people who formed their own judgments about what they meant. There is a line, long and sometimes broken, running from Gutenberg's workshop to every book that has ever been read in bed, every idea absorbed in stillness, every mind that has found comfort or companionship or wonder in words, every child who has fallen asleep with a story still unfolding somewhere behind their eyes, every person who has felt, holding a book in a quiet room, that they were not alone, that someone, somewhere, had thought these thoughts and set them down, and that the distance between that person and this one had been, for a moment, dissolved. That dissolution, the closing of distance between minds across time and space, is the deepest gift of the press. Not merely the multiplication of copies, though that matters, not merely the reduction in price, though that matters too, but the specific, irreplaceable experience of a mind meeting another mind through the medium of a text, in private, without intermediary, on terms the reader chooses. That experience was, before Gutenberg, available to almost no one. After him, it became, slowly and unevenly, but genuinely and permanently, available to almost everyone. The Middle Ages did not end on a single day. There was no morning when Europe woke up medieval and went to sleep modern. The change was slow and uneven and is still, in some senses, incomplete. The rise of the nation-state and the development of democratic governance took longer still. History does not move the way a story moves. It does not have a clear turning point, a moment when everything changes. It has instead a long, slow drift, like a river changing course. The water moving in the same direction, the banks shifting gradually, the landscape transformed over time into something that would be unrecognizable to anyone who had seen it before. But if you had to choose a single moment when the drift began, when the river first began to turn, You might choose the year 1452 in a workshop in Mainz, when a compositor picked up the first piece of type and began to set the first page of the first printed Bible. A small piece of metal, the size of a fingernail, bearing a single backward letter, one of millions, the beginning of everything that followed. You are here tonight at the end of that long line, reading, or half-reading, or simply resting in the presence of words. Whatever you are carrying into this night, the weight of the day, the quiet worries that visit in the dark, you carry it in a world shaped by that small metal letter and by the millions that followed it, a world where knowledge belongs to anyone who reaches for it, where a voice from centuries past can arrive in your hands in your own language tonight. The medieval world is distant now. Its candlelit rooms and patient hands and vast, slow silences have receded into the past, growing quieter with each century. But something of it remains, in the care we still feel for a well-made book, in the reverence we still bring to words that matter, in the stillness that falls when we read something true. And so we leave it there. Somewhere behind you, the day is already distant. The monks are at their benches, the press is still, the words have all been set. Let the past stay where it is, patient, ancient, softly fading. Drift now, if you're ready,